Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessica Kofi. By now, you're well aware of the spread of COVID-19 and its wide effects it's had on society, and most notably the effect it had of canceling live sports and leaving a little bit of a hole where sports fans are trying to fill the time while they're social distancing and really recap a lot of the sports memories that we all know and love. So in the spirit of that and having a little time to spare, I thought, why not continue the same series that we started in the last episode, where we kind of focus on college football classics. And what better time than now to dig into old school rivalries, which are such a huge part of what make college football great. And in a sport that places so much emphasis on tradition and pride like college football does, it's not surprising that hatred for rivals becomes a central talking point within the game. So there are tons of classic rivalries that are still going strong today. And in this episode, we'll continue to recount a handful of the best rivalry battles and some of the best games with a little more focus on the rivalries. So some of these are the best battles in college football history and are definitely worthy of a rewatch. Or if you haven't gone to see them yet, they're definitely worth seeing for the very first time. So to start where we left off last time, we're going to wrap up the rest of the Power 5 conferences, starting with the Big Ten and their rivalries. So the Big Ten is home to some of the sport's most prominent rivalries, with some of them their most elite level teams. Some rivalries are long and have a long history behind them. Others are more on the new side. Some of them are success driven, and some of them are regional battles. Some of them are based off of proximity and don't always correlate to both teams being good. But regardless of any of the categories they may fall in, it's hard to find a week within this conference where some matchup on the schedule isn't going to be a game that blows you away. So at what perfect time to jump into one of the biggest rivalries in the conference between Ohio State and Penn State. So, sometimes Ohio State fans won't admit it, but when they match up with Penn State, they are becoming the opponent that you circle on the calendar. And Penn State might not want to claim that they have an arch rival in the Big Ten, but it's so hard to ignore all of the recent history we've seen between the Buckeyes and the Nittany Lions. And they definitely make a case for being each other's, maybe not top foe for Ohio State, but definitely Penn State's top foe within the conference. And this is another matchup that doesn't just come from both teams being really good in the conference at the same time, but it's kind of a border war because of how close in proximity these two schools are. And it's become such a pivotal battle in the Big Ten East, especially in the last decade. And this one goes back a long time. This is one of those that has a deep history. They've been meeting since 1912, and they've been meeting annually since 1993. So even if it wasn't a rivalry the entire time, these teams know each other very well. And they always kind of have a way of defining each other's season in a way. Penn State won the first 4 matchups that were in Columbus. And then when the Buckeyes took their first ever trip to Happy Valley, they won that one in 1976. And the fact that the series has been so competitive and can go either way has held true over the years, all the way up till 2014 when Ohio State claimed a double overtime win in Happy Valley that helped propel their college football playoff run the first year that it ever existed. And that kind of called back for Penn State fans their top 10 victory about a decade before in 2008 that led Penn State to their Big Ten championship. So there have been bouts back and forth that have either stood in the way of one team's ascent to greatness or have kind of propelled them there. And it's not always close between the two. There have been blowouts for sure, such as the 1994 meeting when the Nittany Lions blew out Ohio State 63-14, and on their way to their first conference title and an undefeated season. And Ohio State, about 2 decades later in 2013, got their own revenge by winning by the same score. So altogether, the rivalry's been pretty even, and the Buckeyes hold a slight advantage, even though the 2010 contest was vacated for both teams, so it doesn't count. But the last 3 meetings, at least, have been all-time classics. They've been close, decided by less than 5 points. Ohio State's won 2 games by 1 point each in games where Penn State has had a double-digit fourth quarter lead and Ohio's had to bounce back to win. So not only in recent years have they proven that they can top their opponents, but they've proven that they're a clutch team and they should be taken more seriously outside of their conference too. So this rivalry is definitely one to keep watching in the Big Ten. And even if there are other teams that are starting to ascend to more prominence within the conference and are starting to battle Ohio State more closely, this one is still definitely a pivotal matchup in the conference. And not to mention, the winner of the last 3 has gone on to win the Big Ten championship. So it is definitely very important to these 2 teams, even if they don't want to admit it. So moving on to the next rivalry within the conference, Nebraska and Iowa are more of a natural rivalry that kind of developed way back in 1891. But it's also been dormant for some time and doesn't really take center stage in the Big Ten, mostly because these teams have had decades where they've struggled to stay on the national stage. But their battle for their rivalry trophy, which they call the Heroes Trophy, was reborn when Nebraska moved to the Big Ten back in 2011. So it makes sense that the schools would become rivals because they're only separated about 300 miles. And during the early days, dates all the way back to 1891, Iowa was actually the first team, the first time that they played outside of their own state was when they went to go play Nebraska. And they used to have a train line that would transport fans back and forth between states. And although it's come a long way from those days, and their most recent history of the rivalry, the Big Ten West battle has just been about as even as it could possibly be, even though Nebraska does hold a slight advantage. But they fell to Iowa 28-20 in 2015, and that was a pretty monumental game because it marked an undefeated 12-0 season for Iowa, and they came within 1 game of surprisingly crushing the college football playoff that season. So these 2 teams might be a little overlooked, but they're definitely not underrated when it comes to competitiveness and rivalry within the Big Ten. So the Heroes game, as it's called, now happens annually on the Friday after Thanksgiving. And the winner takes home the Heroes Trophy, of course. And historically, that edge has usually gone to Nebraska. For about 30 years, between the 1980s and 2012, they won 5 straight games over Iowa before Iowa was even able to pick up their first victory on Nebraska's turf in 70 years. So until 2013, they had been at quite a disadvantage, especially on the road, since Nebraska joined the Big Ten. But in the most recent of histories, Iowa has actually taken the lead within the last decade and leads the series 5-3, including a streak of 4 straight. So even though they may not get the most attention with a lot of heavyweights within their conference, and as their other opponents, the Heroes game, as they like to call it, is definitely still worth paying attention to within the Big Ten. Now we're going to take our first break, but when we come back, we're going to jump over to the Big 12 and look at which rivalries they have that take place outside of Texas.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. Now, before the break, we took a look at 2 Big Ten rivalries that are kind of on the map. And now we're going to hop over and take a peek at the Big 12 and the first 2 rivalries there. And there are only, in the Big 12, 2 in-state rivalries between in-state colleges that are not in Texas. So those are the ones we're going to take a look at first. And the first of the 2 in the Big 12 is the Sunflower Showdown, which is between Kansas State and Kansas. And it's the only annual matchup on the gridiron between the 2. And Kansas has the overall advantage in this series. They have a lead of 65-47-5. But in the more recent history of the series, where they've played for the Governor's Cup trophy, Kansas State narrowly has that lead and has won 11 in a row of that one. So this series is an interesting one, and it's one maybe not a lot of mainstream college football fans pay attention to, because these teams are mostly seen as basketball schools, not necessarily football schools, and not necessarily top tier of football schools at that. So even though this series is the 5th longest in Division I college football history, dating back to 1902, it also is one of the most interesting ones and has a little bit of an interesting history too, particularly the 1980 meeting where the Jayhawks won that game 20-18, but later had to forfeit because it turns out one of their players was declared ineligible by the NCAA. So both schools now dispute the overall record of the Sunflower Showdown, and it just goes to add fuel to the fire for that rivalry. So moving it from the basketball court to the football field maybe isn't the worst idea if you're looking for some new action and some new teams to pay attention to within the Big 12, because they definitely are worth the watch. Now, moving over to the other in-state rivalry in the Big 12 that's not in Texas, Bedlam is a pretty big deal between Oklahoma and Oklahoma State. It is a heated rivalry. It's as heated as in-state rivalries probably get. And the Sooners and the Cowboys have been going head-to-head for so long, and it just makes so much sense as to why they're rivals. Even though Oklahoma has definitely dominated this series, and they hold a large lead over their in-state competitors. But the Cowboys had a signature win of their own, and that came back in 2011 when they beat Oklahoma to seal their own Big 12 title, and they had fans storm the field, which is obviously a big moment in any sporting event. But the Sooners were able to get their revenge, of course, in the next season, and they topped their in-state opponent by 3 in a 51-48 shootout overtime win, which just goes to show how much these teams motivate each other, even when they're both not doing well at the same time. So these schools being just over an hour from each other on Interstate 35 definitely keeps the bad blood alive. And that's part of what we love about rivalries so much, is that it just naturally continues on. There's not really much effort either side has to put into it over generations. It just naturally flows. And this is definitely one of those rivalries that falls into that category. And other than the Red River rivalry, which is a huge Big 12 one played between Oklahoma and Texas during the State Fair of Texas each October, none of the other Big 12 games necessarily have set spots on the schedule each season. And that's how you really know which rivalries are taken the most seriously, because Bedlam has ended the regular season for these squads 12 out of the last 15 years. So the importance of this matchup can't be understated. And even if Oklahoma isn't necessarily part of the longest or most played rivalries amongst conference teams, as this one isn't, they still solidified themselves as Big 12 royalty. And the fact that Oklahoma State regularly competes with them on a yearly basis, whether they're a nationally ranked team or not, is part of what we love about the game so much. It just brings the best out of every side that we're watching. And it's not the oldest rivalry in this conference. That honor goes to a series that's been played since the end of the 19th century, 97 years before the Big 12 Conference even existed and played their first season. So that brings us to our next break. And when we come back, we're going to jump back into the second half of the Big 10 rivalries before we continue on with the Texas side of the Big 12.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
We're back with the College Football Podcast. Now, before the break, we took a little bit of a look at the first half of the Big 10 rivalries and a little bit of Big 12 rivalries that happened outside of the state of Texas as well. Now we're going to jump back into the Big 10 and look at the final two major rivalries that definitely deserve to be rewatched and have games studied while you have some time sitting at home during social distancing. The next of the Big Ten rivalries is a battle for Paul Bunyan's axe. And if you're not already familiar with this rivalry, it might sound a little strange. To anybody outside of Wisconsin or Minnesota, it probably will sound strange regardless, but don't let the strangeness of the name of their trophy fool you, because this one is as intense as they come. And it is the premier battle for the Big Ten West, and one of the conference's longest standing rivalries. Dates back to 1890, and they've met a total of 128 times. So there's definitely no love lost between Wisconsin and Minnesota. And interestingly enough, the Paul Bunyan's axe is the trophy they've been playing for since 1948. But it's not the first trophy that this rivalry has handed out. You know, going back so long, there were definitely decades where they gave out something other than Paul Bunyan's axe, and that just happens to be the slab of bacon. It's the trophy that these two teams initially played for, but it went missing after the 1943 game, mysteriously, when Wisconsin was supposed to hand it over after losing. It hadn't been seen for 50 years, and remarkably, it was found in 1994 by an intern in the Wisconsin's Men's Sports Information Office while cleaning out the storage room, and it was officially deemed lost for all of those decades. But when it was discovered, it had been maintained for some time because the scores of every game between 1930 and 1970, which includes the years that it's supposedly been lost, were all engraved on the back of the trophy. So clearly, Wisconsin felt some type of way about letting go their slab of bacon, and even if they kept it undercover, they were still keeping track of the game's progress over the 4.5 decades that it was missing. So now you can currently find the slab of bacon in the Wisconsin football office, but it does make for a really interesting story about the rivalry, and it does definitely make a comment on how seriously they take it too, and how seriously they've always taken it. So, since these teams have met every year since 1907, this rivalry is actually dead even, believe it or not, at 60-60-8. So they really honestly couldn't get any closer if they tried, and even though they are that close, Wisconsin has kind of taken over this battle for the better part of the last 2 decades, and they've definitely had the edge. They had a remarkable 14-year winning streak, which actually just came to an end this past season when the Gophers finally got a victory behind new head coach PJ Fleck and his Row the Boat campaign. So hopefully the Gophers and PJ Fleck can continue to roll the boat to more wins in this series. But the Badgers are definitely not going to go down without a fight, and they'll probably be looking to start a new win streak pretty soon. So whenever this college football season picks up, battle for Paul Bunyan's axe is definitely going to be a matchup to watch, and it should be one that all college football fans circle on their calendar. And that brings us to another in-state rivalry. And while we've seen all of them get heated, obviously, Michigan and Michigan State are only separated by 65 miles. Ann Arbor and East Lansing are very close to each other. So whenever the Wolverines and the Spartans meet up for their annual battle, it brings some really intense hatred between the two teams. And there's definitely no love lost, and they have had all the time in the world to build up hate towards each other because these two teams have been facing off since 1898. And they've met nearly every year since. So if that's not grounds to breed contempt towards an opponent, I don't know what is. And that's why we get one of the best rivalries and one of the oldest rivalries in all of the Big Ten. And it really didn't even become a conference battle until about 1950 when Michigan State moved into the conference. So that's when they really introduced their Paul Bunyan trophy, not to be confused with Paul Bunyan's axe, which goes to Wisconsin and Minnesota. But the Paul Bunyan trophy came into the Michigan and Michigan State intense rivalry in about 1953. And this is another rivalry where the teams haven't always both been at national prominence at the same time. So it's hard to say that they've always reached the peak of their potential while playing each other. And they don't always have a lot on the line when it comes to conference championships or in the past, bowl game placements, or now the race for the college football playoff. It's been a while since both the teams have been in the race for the same thing, but that definitely doesn't affect the competitiveness of this game at all. These teams have gone through peaks and valleys, but you would be hard-pressed to find any rivalry, not even just in the Big Ten, but any rivalry in college football that has more animosity between these two teams, because Michigan State really has been on the wrong side of a lot of belittling comments, not even just from their arch rival Michigan, but from a lot of fans and a lot of spectators of the sport as well. They've been called little brother versus big brother. One of the matchups between them was billed as number one versus no one, where Michigan was ranked number one in the country. And actually, they were upset in that game by Michigan State. So even when there's a literal stake being driven into the field, as they like to do, which is their tradition, there's definitely no shortage of animosity. And it brings out the best in Michigan State, even in years where they aren't at their best. And the same could be said for the Wolverines. They definitely bring out the best in one another. And that's just something that is only amped up in the last few seasons with the arrivals of their two head coaches within the last decade and a half. And it's just given this rivalry a new light, even though historically Michigan has held a significant edge over their in-state foe, leading the series overall 70, 36, and 5. But the trophy series, since they've been playing for Paul Bunyan's trophy, is a little more even though the Wolverines are still leading that race too. So Michigan State definitely shouldn't be counted out. Regardless, they've won a streak of matchups themselves in recent years, including an improbable last-second victory in 2015 off of a botched Michigan punt and a subsequent touchdown return. So despite everything that has already happened between the two, the battle's best days do seem to be ahead, and that's really exciting to look forward to once the college football season kicks off. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not they can bring this rivalry back to national prominence and on the national stage and kind of make it more important to the entire season. But you should still not expect the heat in this one to be turned down anytime soon. Now it's time to take another break. When we get back, we're going to hop into the Texas side of the Big 12 rivalries.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
We're back with the College Football Podcast. Before the break, we took a look at Big Ten rivalries and capped off the four biggest ones within the conference. And earlier we started to take a look at the Big 12 rivalries, and more specifically, the half of the Big 12 in-state rivalries that take place outside of Texas. And, you know, the Big 12 is a very Southern and Texas specifically dominated conference. So a lot of the rivalries and a lot of the teams come out of that very massive state. But there are no two bigger in-state rivalries in Texas than the two we're about to get into right now, starting with Baylor and TCU, nicknamed the Rivalry. And that's partially because it's between the league's top two private Christian universities. And it dates all the way back to 1899, so another storied, long-standing rivalry, even though their first meeting was actually a scoreless tie. And at the time, they were both located in Waco, Texas. So it definitely has all of the aspects of what makes a rivalry great. It has the location, it has the history, it has stakes being high and games being on the line. So it's not surprising in this one that TCU has a slight edge, even though they've played 115 total matchups. It's really impressive how far back this rivalry goes and how it's still standing today, because there was a 10-season hiatus within the rivalry, even though they both started within the Southwest Conference together for about 7 decades, for a very long time. But it took a break because TCU was left out of the original Big 12 formation in 1996. So there were only 4 non-conference meetings between them before TCU hopped into the conference back in 2012. So it's been a while for this one to get back into the swing of things. But they didn't waste much time, because in 2014, they already were able to make their 110th meeting count because they were both competing in the top 10 that season, with Baylor ranked number 5 and TCU ranked number 9 at the time. And Baylor was able to secure the victory by scoring 24 points in the final 11 minutes of that one, and won off of a field goal as time expired. So there are definitely nail-biting moments within this one, and they're definitely games that stick out and are worth watching. And even 2 months later after that game, both teams finished 11-1, and since there was no Big 12 championship game that year, they were declared co-champions. So they have definitely brought themselves back into the attention of college football fans around the country, not just in Texas or in the Big 12. Within the last few years. So it'll be interesting to see if either team has it in them to continue to rise back up the national stage. Neither of them are as prominent as they used to be, which is why this rivalry doesn't get as much attention as it used to. But with the revival of the rivalry, hopefully that also brings about the revival of these two teams as national powers, because they were unfortunately actually the first two teams left out of the first ever 4-team college football playoff. So it seems like they would both like to redeem themselves from the last few seasons. And what better way to do that than putting up your best against your rival, as we've seen. And that brings us to the ultimate Texas in-state rivalry, and that's Texas versus Texas Tech, which dates back to 1928. So it's not the oldest within the Big 12, and it's also not the most even. The competition for the Chancellor's Cup has definitely leaned in the Longhorns' favor, and Texas has dominated this rivalry against Texas Tech with a 47-15 lead in their all-time matchup count. So as much as Michigan and Michigan State probably could have been seen as big brother, little brother, Texas and Texas Tech definitely carries that air itself. So in the most Texas fashion ever, the competition in this one comes down to the Chancellor Spurs, which is what the winner is awarded. And it's actually a set of gold and silver spurs. So it is very Texas, and it has the embodiment of Texas, which this rivalry in a whole has. As one-sided as it may be, it really is symbolic of how big football is in Texas, and the fact that there are multiple in-state rivalries that still garner attention and are still entertaining to watch, even when one team is so dominant, just makes it really worth giving it more of a deeper dive. Even though the Longhorns have picked up the Chancellor Spurs in at least 13 of their matchups since 1996, it's worth watching to see if Texas Tech, given the success and attention they've gathered in the last few seasons with players like Patrick Mahomes coming to national prominence in the NFL, it'll be great to see whether or not this little brother team is able to bounce back and start making this one a little more even. So Texas and Texas Tech, even though it's not a national rivalry, it's definitely one to keep your eyes on going forward. Now we're going to take one more break, but when we get back, we're going to take a look at one Power 5 conference that gets the least attention out of the group.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. Now, before the break, we talked about the Big Ten Conference and the Big 12 Conference and the biggest rivalries between the two. Ones that get national attention, ones that don't, but still hold a lot of regional significance. And that brings us to the ACC, which is the last of the 5 Power 5 conferences. And the ACC definitely historically hasn't gotten as much attention as the other schools do in the other 4 Power 5 conferences. And they are definitely more known for schools that are good at basketball versus football. But over the past few seasons, the Atlantic Coast Conference has definitely put the country on notice and let fans know that it's not just a basketball league anymore. And instead of being the conference that other conferences come and pick teams out of, and they used to be a huge target for that, now they've instead expanded and formed a scheduling alliance with Notre Dame, and they've given reasons for doubters to start respecting them in a more serious way. So let's get started off with the first matchup, and this rivalry is between Miami and Virginia Tech, and they're they're 2 of the 6 current ACC members that were at one time members of the former Big East Football Conference. And it's been a while since they were all in a conference together, and that means new league members brought all rivalries with them when they moved over into the ACC. And this one is definitely one of the most significant between Miami and Virginia Tech. So when they both ended up back in the same conference in 2004, it added a pair of strong football programs to the conference, and both teams playing within the same coastal division only made it better and more entertaining for people within the region. And their rivalry dates back to 1992 annually, but since 1995 they played 11 games with both of them ranked in the top 25. So there's also been a lot on the line and a lot at stake for these 2 teams, which is a lot different than ACC fans maybe are used to seeing, or college football fans in general are used to seeing from the ACC. But they definitely have had their notable moments, including back in 2000 when they were ranked number 2 and 3. Virginia Tech was 2 and Miami was 3. And the Hurricanes managed to take a lopsided 41-21 victory over the number 2 team in the country at the time. So there are moments where you see a lot on the line, even if they don't garner the most attention. And dating back to their first season in the ACC, They played the final game of that regular season with both teams ranked in the top 10 nationally, and the league crown was also on the line at the time. And that ended up going to the Hokies. Virginia Tech took that 16-10. But a year later, they played another matchup, top 5 matchup, with Miami being number 5 and the Hokies being number 3. And Miami was able to get the upset 27-7 over their in-conference rivals. So there is no shortage of impressive performances that come from these two teams. And just like a lot of other rivalries, they don't always get a lot of national attention, especially in the last few seasons, because both teams have slipped from that peak that they found in the 90s and the early 2000s. But here's hoping that they can regain their powerful in-league status, and it'll definitely help to lock up the ACC as a football conference that should be taken seriously. And if all of that happens, this rivalry can only get better from here. Next on the list is Duke and North Carolina, and this is another one that you are used to seeing on the basketball court, but not necessarily on the gridiron. And it's obviously known nationally as one of the best rivalries in sport overall, but that usually applies to the basketball court. Well, the Blue Devils and the Tar Heels, when they meet up, they are intensely followed by fans that are college basketball fans mostly. And those games are televised nationally. But when they're meeting up on the gridiron, that version isn't necessarily as well followed, and for good reason, because they haven't always been the best teams, and they haven't always been considered good football squads. But it definitely matters in the Triangle in North Carolina, and especially to Duke and North Carolina fans. They are always paying attention, and these teams have been playing annually since 1922. So there's been a lot of bad blood in this rivalry too, but North Carolina does have a slight edge in the series, holding a 59-37-4 edge over their in-state rival. And the Victory Bell, which is the traveling trophy they've played for since 1948, goes to the winner immediately after the game, and it's just become a tradition on top of that for the winning school to spray paint the bell's base in their colors. So Carolina blue for UNC and royal blue for Duke. And you definitely do not want to get those colors mixed up with both of those fan bases around. But interestingly enough, 2 years ago, that celebration, as wild as it can get, carried over to the locker room for the first time. And Duke actually ended up sending UNC a bill for $27,000 for paint damage to their locker room, walls, carpets, you name it, after the Tar Heels continued to spray paint the bell inside of their visiting locker room. So clearly there's some bad blood there, and there's a little bit of a budding hatred there, but there's a long history behind why these teams are so at each other's throats. And North Carolina has dominated overall, but also especially lately in recent years. Between the 90s and 2002, they won 13 consecutive games in this matchup and 23 out of 26 overall. So they've been really impressive, and they're definitely showing why they should be taken more seriously as a football squad. But Duke's rise to prominence in the past decade has kind of changed the tone of this a little bit, because they've won back-to-back games in 2012 and 2013 before North Carolina came back to rout them in the next 2 seasons. So they are starting to make this one a little more interesting again, and a little more of an intra-conference big battle between these two North Carolina squads that usually don't get any attention when it comes to football. So it's definitely great to see new teams starting to get the spotlight instead of the same teams that you hear about all the time in college football always having the most intense rivalries or the most watchable games. So if there's a new rivalry that you'd like to jump in on and get more history behind, Duke and North Carolina is one that has an interesting history and definitely has the chance to put itself at center stage in the ACC and hopefully eventually in college football overall as the ACC continues to get stronger as a football conference. And if they do gain more of that national attention that they're capable of grabbing, it can make this already intense rivalry even hotter. And speaking of hot, that brings us to the Sunshine State rivals, Miami and Florida State. Now, these are two of college football's biggest superpowers dating back to the 1990s. And when Miami joined the ACC in 2004, one of the biggest pluses of this was placing them in the opposite division of Florida State, with the idea that they could upgrade the rivals to yearly crossover opponents and keep the option open for a rematch in the ACC game. So that was just setting the ACC up to take a lot of football attention away from the other Power 5 conferences. And it was a great opportunity for both of these schools to stay on main college football fans' minds. But unfortunately, the ascent to national prominence hasn't really happened in the way they expected, mostly because the Hurricanes have struggled so much over the last few seasons, over the past decade or so. And this matchup struggles a little bit to stick to people's memories because it lacks a lot of the long-term history that most other teams and most other rivals have. But the hostility is not lost, and it's just as high as teams who have been meeting since the 19th century. And it still matters, especially in Florida, because these two teams, Florida State and Miami, heavily recruit in the same area and are going for the same prospects a lot of the time. So making this game a big one is a big deal for the state of Florida and for a lot of different reasons. And so far, Miami is holding a narrow 34-30 lead in the all-time matchup. But this rivalry comes with some fantastic moments and fantastic finishes that are worth taking a highlights look at. For a while there during the 90s, there was more talent on the field when these two teams met up than there were in NFL stadiums, and everybody wanted to put on a show, and you'd see a ton of familiar faces, both from the college world and from the pro football world. And there have been some classic games that have come out of it, such as the 2006 matchup between these two, which was one of the most watched college football games in history. So it's definitely worth taking another look at if you feel like going back and rewatching a game. And whether it's played in Tallahassee or in Miami, there is a ton of trash talk going on between the two, to say the least. And there might be some triggering memories for each side, especially FSU fans. You might not want to go up to them and say wide right, because it might make them cringe to still hear those words, because they have not lost on a wide right field goal once, but 4 times, believe it or not. There are 4 different games where Florida State lost to Miami on a wide right field goal. And on top of that, there was one where they lost on a wide left field goal. So field goals are not necessarily Florida State's friend in this rivalry, and it might be a sore spot if you bring them up to Florida State Seminole fans. But that's been their fate against the Hurricane many times, and they are not lost to how painful it is to lose in this matchup to your in-state rival. So even though Florida State has had more of the upper hand this past decade, Miami's been competitive. The 3 games were decided by 5 points or less, so they usually have been playing them close as of late. They just haven't always been able to break through for the win. But here's hoping that this rivalry gets some of its old juice back, and the Hurricanes and the Seminoles can get back to the same level, and not just the same level, but the nationally elite level. And that brings us to the final ACC rivalry matchup, and maybe the biggest ACC rivalry matchup, depending on where your allegiances lie, because Clemson and Florida State in the modern ACC have definitely taken the top spot and separated themselves from the rest of the group. There's them, and then there's everybody else on a tier below. So this goes back to when they joined the conference back in 92. and Florida State was immediately the 800-pound gorilla in the room. They were the team to beat. They came in and they pushed Clemson off of the perch that they had enjoyed in the ACC since the 1980s, up until that time. So they've kind of remained the national power out of this group up until recent years, when now Clemson has rejoined the party, and Tigers are now national power again, and they're enjoying the same type of nationally elite recruiting level that the Seminoles are. So it's brought this competition even closer than it's been in the past. And now these teams have to face off against each other head to head, in order to really prove who's better. And even before the game had reached that elite level in the last few years, it had always been special and it had always been meaningful for some time, because it used to be known as the Bowdoin Bowl, and it pitted father and son against each other on opposite teams. And who doesn't love that when it comes to sports, especially when it's relatives against relatives? But father and son is pretty classic. And it was the father, Bobby Bowden of Florida State, against the son, Tommy Bowden of Clemson, between 1999 and 2007. And father knows best, and he came out 5-4 overall in the series, with a slight edge before it ended when Tommy resigned from Clemson midway through the 2008 season. So since then, there really wasn't much attention to bring back to this one, until more recently in recent seasons, when the winner of this matchup usually represents the Atlantic Division in the ACC title game, and they've really exchanged ACC titles back and forth within the last few years. So this one is toe-to-toe once again, making it one of the most interesting, underrated rivalries in all of college football, because there's usually a lot on the line, but not a lot of eyes on them. That usually changes when the team comes out of the ACC and in recent years makes it to the college football playoffs. And Florida State was the last winner before the playoff was implemented. And of course, we know Clemson has won twice since then. So it's easy to see that in this rivalry, the atmosphere is a little bit different. The fans want this, the players want it, the coaches want it, everybody's excited for this one, and neither side shows any sign of slowing down, and that's the best part about it, because they definitely have the case of being the ACC's best rivalry, and if anybody's going to put the ACC on the national map, it'll be these two. So don't take your eyes off of Clemson and Florida State, because their prominence shouldn't be changing anytime soon. Now it's time for one last break, but when we come back, we're going to dive into some of history's most rewatchable games.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
And welcome back to the College Football Podcast. And before the break, we took a look at the top rivalries in the Big Ten, the Big 12, and the ACC. So now that we've given a little bit of an overview of which teams have the best matchup, in case you want to take a deeper dive into any of their games, why don't we take a look ourselves into some of history's most rewatchable games and give you a little bit of a place to start in each conference. So we can kick it off with Nebraska and Oklahoma and their 1971 matchup, which was a Thanksgiving feast that they treated the American public to. There were 829 total yards of offense, there were 4 lead changes, 1 penalty, and ultimately the game became billed as the game of the century because it certainly lived up to that title. It was a 72-yard punt return that at the time was thought to be the game winner, but it only came after Oklahoma's first possession at the time. And they scored on 5 drives of at least 69 total yards against a defense that didn't allow more than 17 points to anyone else. And it came back to the last of Nebraska's touchdown runs. They had 4 short ones in the game. The last one came with 1:38 left to play, and it flipped the scoreboard 35-31 in their favor. And the game of the century is still one of the most prominent games to this day, and it's classic college football at its finest. And it definitely deserves to be given a look by a lot of people for the first time. And that brings us to a more recent battle in college football history between Appalachian State and Michigan in 2007. And back then, when the number 5 Wolverines were definitely one of the teams to beat in the country, they would have been the heavy odds favorite if Las Vegas had even bothered to sell a betting line for that game. But the Mountaineers out of Appalachian State were 2-time defending FCS champions, and they were not going down without a fight. They seemed to have magic at quarterback on their side in Armonte Edwards, and it was a frantic game, especially in the final 5 minutes, where 2 of the game's 4 lead changes came down to that time frame, and the Mountaineers drove 69 yards for a 24-yard field goal and retook the lead with just over a minute to play before Michigan came back and responded with a long pass to set up a 37-yard field goal for themselves with 6 seconds left to play. But just when you thought that it was going to go in Michigan's favor, Appalachian State's Corey Lynch blocked the kick and sealed a 34-32 victory. And this game went directly into the history books ever since. And it is definitely a game that has high rewatch value. It's entertaining. It's just as entertaining as when it was live on TV back in 2007. And since a lot of maybe younger college football fans don't exactly know the entire history of every great game, it would definitely be a good way to get educated on college football's history and just draw in attention of maybe new fans in general. So this is definitely a historic game that hasn't been forgotten about in the years since, and there's a good reason, and I suggest highly that you go check this one out. One of the most memorable matchups, which also could be called a rivalry, but it definitely is just a memorable overall matchup, comes between Notre Dame and Miami, and more specifically their 1988 meeting, because 3 decades later, it is still a game that's being argued over by Miami's head coach at the time, Jimmy Johnson, who isn't even with the school anymore, who isn't even coaching anymore. And I'm sure Miami fans are arguing right along with him because on that crisp fall day in 1988, controversy was born that actually led to the creation of the replay rule. Because if the replay rule had existed at the time, and a lot of college football fans still stand by this, a lot of the controversy surrounding a score by running back Cleveland Gary could have gone in Miami's favor in this game and could have been the deciding factor. And there was a lot of debate whether or not he had fumbled the ball, was down, or had scored. And Canes could have won their 37th consecutive regular season game. It was a big moment for them and a big time in their history. They're at the top of their peak at the time in 1988. And not to mention, they were going after their second consecutive national championship. But there's a reason why this game lives on in infamy. And it doesn't live on in infamy if it doesn't grab the emotions of everyone who's watching and live on in fans' memories. So Catholics versus Convicts is one of the most infamous games of all of college football history. It has a lot of its own documentaries made about it. I highly recommend you go check those out as well. And there's just so much history and so much animosity that still stems from this game, definitely going into this game at the time it was played, but definitely created more coming out of it as well. And it just lives on in Notre Dame lore, because this one ended with a 2-point conversion being batted away with 45 seconds left trying to thwart Miami's comeback. And instead of scoring on a final play to take this game, Miami ended up falling by 1 point, 31-30, in heartbreaking fashion. But that's what we love most about college football, is all the emotions that get dragged into it, and the way it makes fans feel when they see their teams win or lose. And in this one, it definitely stuck around with Miami Hurricanes fan. It definitely stuck around with the players and the coaches that were on the field for that Catholics versus Convicts game. But it, more importantly, left a mark on the game of football as a whole. And now we have the replay rule, and at this point in time, it is impossible to think of what the game would look like without replay. And it's already complicated enough with replay. So thinking about how much more difficult it would have been back then to finish this game without having the opportunity to replay certain plays that could have been a game changer is really significant to the norms of the game today. But at the same time, saying that replay would have affected Miami's chances to win is still a little bit on the rocky side of an argument, especially for Notre Dame fans, because Miami did give up 7 turnovers within the game. So they had more than one chance to win. A lot of people will point out that they had more than one chance to win, and it doesn't always come down to the last minute opportunities. But the battle will live on, and pick whichever side you want to fight on, because it doesn't sound like these fan bases are going to slow down anytime soon. Thanks for listening to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network, from football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.